I just thought I would throw this review together because I don't see any reviews for this game on YouTube. Of course, back in the day there were all kinds of written reviews, but who's going to dig up a PDF of a 10-year-old magazine, or 22-year-old magazine, matter of fact, to read a review of this game? No one. So just as a quick note, this is going to be a spoiler-free review. I'm not going to discuss any aspect of the story. And with that, I'm going to jump into something that everyone's going to wonder about immediately. How does this game run on modern hardware? Well, I had no issue with the game. Only suffered a single crash during my 30 hours or so of playtime, and I believe it occurred because I was pressing an attack button during one of the little in-game cutscenes. And not a proper cutscene, but it's a little scene in which control is taken away from you. And the only bug I encountered during my entire playthrough, that I'm aware of anyway, was that a single quest never got crossed out in the journal, even though I had already met the requirements for completion. But that's trivial. I mean, I was still able to complete the game. It didn't really matter. I mean, something not being crossed out in the journal is about as trivial as it gets. So the game runs perfectly fine on modern hardware, as far as I can discern. The control scheme is pretty nice. Like Gothic, it's a unique control scheme. It's going to take a little bit of time to adjust to it, but it's pretty easily memorized, and it requires very little hand movement because most of the keys you're going to be using are adjacent to one another. So it's a good control scheme, very easy to use. You'll get used to it very quickly. The point and click movement is a little bit of an issue because even with always run turned on, your character will still walk to locations occasionally. So you might have to right click again to actually activate a run. Now this wouldn't be a particularly big deal if not for the fact that during the final hours of the game there are enemies that are way too difficult to take on, and you're just going to want to outrun them. So the point and click movement can be a bit of an issue. Combat is pretty straightforward and is more or less the same for the melee, magic, and missile weapons, bows and arrows, and crossbows and bolts, and that you're going to be pressing a directional key to select a target, and then you're going to press one of the action keys. And I say that you're going to be pressing the action keys and not the attack keys because the attack keys are also used for everything else in the game, from opening up doors with a key, to drinking potions, to reading scrolls, casting healing spells, and so on. So all melee weapons have up to 5 different attacks which can be executed, and to be capable of executing the higher tier attacks, your combat statistic must be appropriately high. Every single spellbook in the game has 5 different spells, and your level must be sufficiently high in order to cast those higher tier spells. So it's similar to the melee in that there is a tier system and you have to reach a certain threshold to actually be able to use the higher tiers. Now the combat and level requirements for the various tiers across different weapons and spellbooks varies. That is to say that a level requirement of 20 might be sufficient to cast every spell within a particular spellbook, but not another spellbook. And a combat skill of 40 might be sufficient to execute every attack with one weapon, but not another. When you stand perfectly still, you don't execute any attack, you dodge, and your percentage chance to dodge is determined by your combat statistic also. Terrain is relevant to combat in that you have to execute upward strikes to attack enemies on higher elevation, and vice versa. You have to execute downward attacks to hit enemies that are below you. And that's kind of nice. I like that. You don't really see that factor into most games, especially older games. There are different damage types, but this is never really actually explained in the game. And it's not shown in the UI with the hard numbers, so like if you were to look at a weapon, it wouldn't say that it does this much of this type of damage and this much of this type of damage. It just says damage. You have to figure out for yourself using common sense and experimentation which weapons are appropriate for which enemies. So keep that in mind. There are different types of damage in the game, even though it's not stated explicitly. As for the magic system, there are 5 different elements in the game, and each spell has 1 element assigned to it. And as you use spells, your secularum, which measures your affinity for different elements, will adjust accordingly. So if you use exclusively fire spells, your secularum will become dominated by fire to the detriment of the opposing element, which in this game I think is earth, but it could be water. I'm not 100%. I'm pretty sure it's actually earth is the element that opposes fire in this game. So as you become more proficient in one element, you become less proficient with the opposing element. Now, I'm not sure to what extent this actually affects anything. I don't know if the maximum change in spell effectiveness is 10% or 100% or what. I don't know. I didn't notice really any difference. But I know the manual says that spells become more powerful as you specialize, so there you go. Go with what the manual says, I guess. On a final note for the combat, it actually takes time to switch between weapons, forcing you to make sure you've actually got a weapon in good condition equipped if the fight is against a challenging enemy. It also takes time to switch between healing items and weapons, so you can't have a potion in one hand and a sword in another. You can only use one or the other, so that's something to keep in mind. You can't just stand right in front of an enemy, switch to a healing potion, drink it, and expect to be alright. I mean, they're going to kill you as you're drinking it. Since I mentioned weapon condition kind of offhandedly, I guess I should go into a little bit more depth about it. So, weapons and armor have condition. It works just like any other game, where armor in perfect condition obviously is going to protect you better than armor in near broken condition, and when armor breaks, it is removed from your inventory, and it's the same with weapons. Yeah, the difference between a weapon in the highest condition tier and the lowest condition tier can be the difference between killing the enemy in 4 or 5 hits and not doing any damage at all, because damage is a dice roll. If it's in the lowest condition tier, it's going to do basically nothing, and it might not even do any damage at all, like I just said. Before you enter combat, you're going to want to make sure that you've got weapons that are at least in the second highest condition tier, so that you actually do some damage to them, because otherwise, you might not do anything and you'll just end up getting killed over and over. So now I'm going to touch upon what I think is the biggest issue in the entire game. It's relatively, well, I don't want to say it's really a relatively minor issue, because it's a big issue, but it's something that only takes up a small amount of the playtime in all likelihood. So an NPC tells you, this is in about the final third of the game roughly. This is about 3/4 of the way through the game, something like that. But an NPC tells you to go to a location that has never been referenced before, and there's no way of discerning where the location is without just stumbling upon it or looking at a guide. So they tell you to go to this location. They don't tell you what map cell it's in, and they don't even tell you the general region. And you might do what I did and just search every map cell in the general region that the NPC was in. You would not find it, because the specific location is actually in a map cell in an entirely different region of the game than where this NPC is. No other NPC will tell you where this location is, and there are no maps for sale in the game. So you have no way to discover the location aside from, like I said, just stumbling upon it. There's no way of figuring out where it is with just the in-game information. And what's strange is that this is the first and really only time that this is ever an issue. Navigation in the game is pretty easy for the most part. I mean, you can find every other location you're told to visit, because the NPC will tell you the name of the map cell, they'll usually tell you the direction, and then there are also road signs that tell you where a lot of the major locations are, so navigation is only an issue this one time. And it's kind of a big deal because this is a quest that's actually necessary to advance the story and thus complete the game. This could have been easily rectified by adding in a single line of dialogue indicating which map cell this specific location is actually in, as was done for every single quest up to this point and after this point, but it is what it is. Not a particularly big issue. I mean, you could search the entire game world in probably 4 hours max, so there you go. I mean, you might run across it in a half hour if you just get lucky with your guessing, so it's not a huge deal, but it is frustrating. I spent about 2 hours searching the game world for this specific location before I broke it down and looked at a guide. There's one more instance of this sort of lack of direction in the game, so towards the very end of the game you have to go to a separate realm, and there's an NPC in the normal game world who's got an item that will allow you to traverse this realm without being attacked by these otherwise hostile NPCs. But the game never makes any connection between that NPC and this realm. They never establish that this NPC is from that realm or that they have any connection to that realm. So if you're just playing the game blind, you have no way of knowing that you should go talk to this particular NPC to get this item that will allow you to traverse this realm unmolested. Now, I could be mistaken. Maybe there's some reference in game, but if there was, it must be very obscure. So I don't know how the game expected you to know that this NPC has any connection to this realm. Alright, now we're going to get on to my completely subjective analysis of the game, my personal feelings toward the game. I felt that the combat was pretty good. The combat is very straightforward from a mechanical perspective. You're basically just going to be spamming the attack button until the enemies are dead and run away and heal as necessary. But the enemy variety and the need to switch weapons to even deal damage to different enemies was pretty nice. It's also nice that terrain is a factor in this game. Overall, I enjoyed the combat, but ranged weapons and spells really feel completely worthless in this game because of the time it actually takes to switch weapons, and because of the relatively low damage output. I mean, even the mid-game melee weapons deal way more damage per second than spells and bows and crossbows, so there's really no reason to use them. I mean, are you really going to use a crossbow when an enemy's right on top of you, cutting you up? It's just not effective. And like I said, it takes time in-game to actually switch weapons, so you're at kind of a disadvantage if you're trying to rely on ranged weapons and spells in this game. Now, arguably the combat is simplistic and repetitive, but I found it enjoyable. I mean, arguably the combat in most games is pretty repetitive. You'll just have to play the game and find out if you enjoyed it. I think the game looks beautiful due to the masterful use of color. Every map cell has a great deal of color variety, and the color contrasts within the environments are very nice. But you have to make your own determination about this. A lot of people feel that the game is very ugly due to the poor texture quality. So, again, you'll just have to make up your own mind about it. Also love the sound design. I think all the sound effects are great, especially the combat sound effects and the running water sound effect that they have near rivers, and there are a few little smaller bodies of water. Soundtrack, also great. Most of it fits into the setting pretty well. Sounds like genuine music of old, old medieval European music, so very nice soundtrack. Overall, I just thought it was a great game. I can tell you for certain that it's going to be a polarizing game due to the controls and due to the point-and-click movement and the poor texture quality. It's never going to be popular with the younger generations, but I would recommend it anyway.